you're Matthew and I'm Micah Erfan. Like you're just Matthew.
Yeah. All right. Hello, everyone. So we're live. So here's Micah Erfan. And we're going to be chatting about various topics related to utilitarianism. It seems that our primary disagreement is about psychological hedonism. So we agree about prudential hedonism, that the only thing that makes one's life good is how much happens. The claim that we disagree about is psychological hedonism, which is the claim that one's motivations are entirely about maximizing their own happiness. So you just want to start by like laying out the basic case for psychological hedonism, and then I'll present some objection.
You want me to lay out the case? Sorry, you cut out for a second.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So in order to have like a coherent philosophy, we have to kind of have an understanding about what humans want and how we operate. And so we need to make some sort of assumption or some sort of theory that explains human behavior and human motivation. And to me, psychological hedonism is the most convincing. Essentially, the idea that every single person wants to experience pleasure and wants to avoid suffering, and like that inherent part that desire is kind of inherent to our existence as biological organisms. In no way can we ever want inherently the experience of suffering. We can want things that lead us to suffering, but we usually want that because we associate it with positive feelings. So we act based off of positive and negative associations, which are based on this drive towards pleasure and aversion to suffering. And the way that we can like test this is we can try to apply it anecdotally. It's kind of hard to imply this empirically speaking because we can't see into people's minds. We can only see how people operate and what decisions they make, and then try to find a theory that explains why they're acting the way they are. And so there's a lot of examples that people bring up against psychological hedonism. Like, for example, sometimes parents will like sacrifice their lives for like their children, right? Like that's one of the more common ones. And so this would intuitively contradict like the psychological hedonist idea on its face, because I mean, generally speaking, you wouldn't think sacrificing yourself would be in your interest. But I think there's explanations for these types of examples. In this case, I would say it's because part of our evolutionary like instincts are certain like embedded positive and negative associations, right? And so like there's certain things we have negative associations with because they look scary, right? Looking scary is a instinctual negative association in many cases. Things that look nice can be instinctual as well. And in this case, there's an instinct for us to have a very positive association with protecting our family and the people that we really care about, and a very negative association with suffering happening to them, especially in the case that it's our child.
Yeah. So I mean, we can start with that example, because I do think that that's a decent example. So I would agree that we have various things that we have positive and negative associations with. But the question is, so regardless of our positive and negative associations, even if we think that those were caused by hedonic conditioning, when the person's making the decision about whether or not to sacrifice themselves to save their child, or even whether or not to undergo a period of prolonged agony to save their child, you can imagine many parents who would undergo a period of prolonged agony to save their child. They are clearly under no illusions that it'll be good for their long-term happiness. So I'm not sure how the causal story of how we acquired the beliefs in the first place, of how we acquired it through positive and negative association, rescues psychological hedonism, given that psychological hedonism makes the claim that if the person thought that it would increase that they'd only do it if they thought it would increase their well-being. But people are clearly willing to do it even when they don't think it will increase their well-being.
So I think it's probably a little bit more complex than that. I wouldn't postulate that people always rationally pursue what's in their best interest. I think many times people are very irrational, but I think how we define their interests is inherently hedonic. It's impossible to separate from hedonism. Like experiencing pleasure is what is in my interest, and that's what I want. Whether I always do so is I'm a very irrational, limited person. I have a limited understanding about what brings about that state that I want. And in many cases, I don't think properly about it. Sometimes I have like sociocultural, or in this case, probably more instinctual elements of me that drive me towards behaviors that, like, when you really think about it, don't make much sense when it comes to my interest. But they can be explained by the positive and negative associations. And to kind of illustrate this a little bit more, I'm going to bring up the experience machine, because that is like the I think one of the most popular arguments against this. I linked in my article about this, the Secular Guide to Life, a paper that kind of explains in part like a kind of an answer to that. And to me, the experience machine, which is, for those who don't know, the idea that you could be offered to enter in this machine of maximal pleasure for eternity. And like, would that be, the question is essentially, would you enter into that machine? Many times people say no. The argument against that is really saying no is irrational. But the reason why people have a tendency to do it is because there's kind of these implicit risks we assume with that, right? The fact that it's a machine means that it might be controlled by other people. It might be accessed by other people. We don't want to leave like our relatives and people around. We have negative associations with just abandoning everybody. If you change it to remove these kind of like these implicit biases that we have, would you choose to live in a world where everything went your way and it was like maximally happy? I think a lot more people would say yes. But even people that said no, that wouldn't necessarily disprove the theory, because people are not rational. All right. So I hope that was at least somewhat adequate at responding to what you said.
Well, so I agree that people are not rational. And I also agree with you that what is in a person's interest is what increases their pleasure. But so the thing that I disagree about with the claim that what motivates people is only considerations of pleasure. It seems like we would have to accept. So what you're pointing out is that there are various psychological factors that motivate us. For example, psychological conditioning, our positive and negative associations towards things. But even if but the fact that our motivations are off. So in the case of the positive and negative associations, that's sort of an instinctive reaction. But even in the case where it's not an instinctive reaction, even in the case where the person has a lot of time to think, and you ask the person what's ultimately consistent with their values, it seems very clear that most people, that most people, upon reflection, or at least that many people, would not always prefer a state of affairs in which they had more pleasure. So many people would prefer a life in which they were more miserable, but their child was happier. And so if the claim is just that we're sometimes mistaken about what's in our interest, well, that's certainly true. But the claim, psychological hedonism, isn't a claim about what's in our interest. It's a claim about what we aim for. And so I think that,
I think I don't really fully disagree with you, actually. I think that the most inherent part of this is just the accepting the like hedonist premise that that's what is in our interest and that's what we want, and we have an aversion to suffering. I guess in the case of motivation, I wouldn't define hedonism as saying you're always going to act, even in your perception, in like raw terms of what's in your best interest, even though that perception is flawed. I think you have to factor in the positive and negative associations, which are inherently hedonic kind of instincts. Those are hedonic in nature. And I think almost all of the kind of irrationalities in our action, even when we're actually considering options, or even when we have an accurate perception of reality, can be explained by those. Those are hedonic. As long as the positive and negative associations are hedonic, what's determining our decision is a hedonic calculation.
Well, but I don't think it's true that what is determining our. So let's imagine that the following story is true. Let's say that I currently have the motivation to minimize my happiness. And the reason I have them, or actually, that's a big example. Let's say that I currently just don't care about my happiness and only care about the happiness of my child. And the reason for this is because in the past, whenever I've cared about my happiness, it's caused suffering. So as a result, I'm not consciously aware of that fact about my motivations, but it's merely the case that my motivations are such that the causal story about how I have those motivations has to do with hedonic, with experiences of pleasure and pain that have conditioned me. In that case, if I don't care about my pleasure at all, and I only care about the pleasure of my children, regardless of the causal story of how I got that desire, that would seem to be incompatible with psychological
I mean,
hedonism.
I think that would totally be compatible. Maybe we just have different definitions of this, which is fine, because I mean, people have like even in the quite small psychological hedonist community, there's a lot of debates about what psychological hedonism actually means and what its burden of proof is. So that wouldn't be something that's rare. But to me, if like an implicit and maybe unconscious hedonic calculation pushed you towards a mindset that was not hedonic, it would still be hedonic because that was the reason you were doing it. You were only thinking this way or making this action because of that association. And so what you'd really have to prove, I guess, is that people were knowingly making decisions without any kind of biases or associations that they thought would make them suffer way more compared to the other options when you isolate for all the biases. And I just I feel like that's unfeasible. Maybe it's possible. It just seems pretty unfeasible to me.
Yeah, well, so just to be clear, so I would agree that if the claim was that every time a person makes a moral decision, they're doing an implicit hedonic calculus, but they just sometimes calculate wrong,
that's my whole postulation.
Well, but in the case where, but what you seem to be stating earlier was something different. What you seem to be stating earlier was that the way that we acquire through the desires is through hedonic conditioning. Now, I'm somewhat skeptical of that hypothesis, but I think that it's much more plausible that we acquire the desires through hedonic conditioning than it is that, the mother who jumps on the grenade to save her child is just really wants to do what makes her happiest, but is just very mistaken about what would make her happiest.
Yeah, I may have articulated myself poorly, but I think we actually agree on this, because I definitely don't think that at each moment and each point, it's feasible to think that people are like, oh, they're like egoists. What's exactly in my interest here and what's my interest there? That would be a pretty bad theory of human action.
Okay, so you agree that people aim for things other than pleasure.
Oh, for sure. We have proxies all the time. We have, and I think I talked about that in here. We have proxies because it's impossible to aim for pleasure. It's kind of abstract. We can only associate it with certain behaviors and certain actions and certain things. And so we have these proxies, and then we get proxies of these proxies, and then we have the biases and associations. And eventually, it becomes just it's connected. It's all about pleasure in the end of the day. But we're not chasing that directly because that would just not be possible.
Okay, so I'm not sure if your claim is that all of our desires came from some combination of or either the direct desire for pleasure or came from acting on heuristics for pleasure. Well, I think that the heuristic process where things tend to promote pleasure, so we take them to be valuable even when they're only derivatively valuable, I think that explains how we come to some of our judgments that we care about things other than pleasure. But I don't think that it can explain why. I mean, I'm skeptical of the account that says that that's able to explain, just every single one of our non-hedonic motivations. Yeah, I think that. So, I think that whether. So I think generally psychological hedonism is the notion that the only thing that people aim at is their own pleasure, and maybe they develop other things that they care about derivatively because they think that those things will have the tendency to promote their pleasure. But my claim is that no, there are lots of things that people care about even when they don't have a tendency to promote their pleasure, right? So I would care about a genocide. I would be opposed to a genocide happening a galaxy away, even if it had no impact on my pleasure. And even if it were the case, if I heard that there was a genocide happening a galaxy away, it wouldn't make me very sad. I mean, there are a sufficiently large number of bad things in the world that just hearing abstractly that there's a bad thing doesn't necessarily doesn't generally produce any strong emotional reaction. But nonetheless, I would still, have a desire for it not to happen, even if it doesn't produce any.
I think that's fully explicable. I mean, same here, right? We don't like it when things suffer. I guess we're social creatures. So I'd prefer ceteris paribus that less things suffer than more things suffer, because I don't like that. That's something that makes me feel bad when things are like, if I heard that a genocide was happening and for some reason part of my nature made me feel really good about that happening, well, I probably wouldn't do very much advocacy against genocide if it made me feel really good to know genocide was happening, right? But that's not how I am.
Well, I would dispute the point in that I think, if I found out that a genocide was happening a galaxy away, it wouldn't make me sad at all. I would have a desire for it to stop, but I don't dislike the genocide in the way that I dislike being in pain. I have a conscious higher order thought that I would like for this thing not to happen, such that I would be willing to undergo sacrifices to make it not happen. But it doesn't weigh on me emotionally. One I think clear counterexample to the claim that what people do to the claim that you made earlier is I really like eating meat, and even knowing, I like the taste of meat, and if I even after knowing the facts about the suffering caused by factory farming, I would still, enjoy life more if I ate meat. And yet, despite that, I have the desire not to eat meat, not because eating meat would make me sad whenever I eat meat or anything like that, but because I just have desires that are not purely about my own well-being.
I think there's more to it than that. I think in many cases when people choose to be vegan, they choose to do so because they don't want animals to suffer, because when animals suffer, that makes them upset. If animal suffering made me very happy, I doubt very many people. I doubt I would be a vegan for sure. I would definitely not be a vegan in that case. But I doubt you would be a vegan as well. I think there's also people assert health benefits, and there's a virtue signal. There's a social element, right? We like to signal to other social creatures that we're a very social creature and we're very empathetic and very caring. And that's fair. That's good. It's part of the reason why we could be so successful as a species, but it's a benefit in terms of utility for you to be that way. So I think if you took all of these elements and we could flip them on their heads, right? Let's say that now you were socially ostracized for being vegan. Everybody hates you. And you love it when animals suffer. That for some reason you're just insane. You love it like it's the best thing ever. Okay, and there's no health benefits. Actually, veganism is absolutely atrocious for your health. Would it make sense? Would you still choose to be a vegan? You could say yes. I find that pretty dubious. I really doubt that would be the case. And I think part of the reason why so few people are vegans is because so few people can, even in their minds, do any sort of calculation that would justify that in terms of utility. People don't make decisions usually based off of morality. What they think is just abstractly, theoretically correct. Some people do, and I think that that's because some people have very, very strong associations, usually because they're religious. Most people do it seems very plainly in their, at least their loose, very abstract understanding of their interests implicitly.
Yeah, I think that in the case, so there's certainly a amount of harm. Like if it turned out that to eat meat I had to be an immense agony, or to be vegan I had to be brutally tortured all the time, then I probably wouldn't be vegan. There's clearly an amount of misery that would dissuade me from veganism. But right now, I would be a happier person if I ate meat. I would enjoy life more. I'm quite aware of that fact. And in fact, when the meals I have where I accidentally have meat, like if I, by accident get something with meat that I didn't mean to, I enjoy those meals more than the ones that don't. So I think that the fact that there are cases like this shows that, veganism for some is caused by a sympathy towards animals. Lots of vegans, I think, would just be, sad eating meat. But that's certainly not the case for all of them. And I mean, even if you got rid of all the health benefits and so on, I think, I'm perfectly willing to grant that I would be happier eating meat, and yet I would still not have a desire. Like I still have there can be things that have no emotional resonance with me, but that nonetheless I take to motivate my actions because I take there to be moral considerations that count in favor of various acts. So, for example,
I think it's because you have a value for being moral. Like you find a value in that, and that's a hedonic thing. If morality always brought me suffering, if being moral always made me suffer, and I was perfectly capable of that, understanding and comprehending that fact, I would not be moral. I simply would not. I'd lack any motivation to do so. Right. And so I think you can say that you're vegan for reasons other than that, and that you acknowledge and you're perfectly aware that actually eating meat would make your life better, and like in terms of utility. To me, I mean, I can't go into your head, right? From my experiences, I can never imagine a situation where I'm really aware of that fact. I can say that I'm aware of this fact, but that doesn't mean I always necessarily believe it, and I would still make that decision anyway. I think, but like I said, our decision making is not always in line either with our active thought process. Those are different things as well, right? So like a drug addict continues to consume drugs even though they know that's probably not their long-term interest, right? It's because of an association with pleasure. They take drugs because they want to feel good, and we do want to feel good when we think and make decisions. But many times we make a decision different than what our head says, right? So yeah.
Well, so I mean, so I agree that it's hard to interrogate other people's head, but I mean, there just seem to be so many cases of people who are acting in ways that seem to predictably result in them having less pleasure. And I don't think that it's plausible. So, I mean, so you said that you would only be moral, that if being moral made you unhappy, then you wouldn't be moral. Well, consider the more limited subset of cases of doing what's right, even in cases where it's worse for you. Lots of people, there are many cases in which lots of people do what's right, even when it's bad for them. Unfortunately, not as much as we would like. But sure. So as a result, in this limited subset of cases, I think this shows, this limited subset of cases is one in which
I don't think so.
Every time a person does what's right, even in ways that don't increase, that make their life worse, every time they do that, it is bad for their utility. And so if it were the case that for a subset of right actions, every time it happened, if it was always bad for our utility, then we wouldn't want to do it. Well, then no one would ever want to do what's right, even in cases where it's worse for them. But people clearly often do want to do that and often do that.
So I think there's a lot of different explanations for this, but I think this is only an argument against the very rudimentary hedonic model, which, I mean, we've already kind of both acknowledged is not the one that I would ever support. So first, a lot of times when people make moral actions, even though nobody's looking around, it's because they're religious. And religion is like the ultimate kind of carrot stick approach. You follow these rules and you get eternal bliss. You don't follow these rules, you get eternal suffering. I mean, it's literally extremely hedonic in its explanation, right?
But I think that a lot of, I think sorry, a point on that before you go on. I mean, I think for a lot of religious people, while it's true that religion has a carrot and a stick, I think a lot of religious people would be motivated to do, I mean, I think in cases where a Christian doesn't give someone $5 who they could that would benefit them, I don't think that they think that they won't go to heaven for that.
Those who sow will reap, right? That's in the Bible, isn't it? You receive back how you treat others. So whenever you bless others, you are blessed. That's the idea. It's utilitarian. It's hedonic, right? If I bless other people and give them money, I will suffer. Nobody's going to do it. Now, in terms of there's further explanations to this, because obviously not everybody who does good things when no one's looking is a religious person. I think that's totally because we have positive associations, because in the majority of cases, this is what brings up better outcomes for me, right? We live in societies, and part of the reason, one of the most essential elements of these societies being able to operate is to organize incentives so pro-social behavior is the most beneficial course of action. That's why we're successful. And so when you look back in history and systems where were like, perfectly chaotic or like anarchic, you didn't see that so much, right? You didn't see nearly as much pro-social behavior. You saw a lot of absolutely terrible things happening all the time. Why? Well, because there was not a reason to do the pro-social behavior, because it was not rewarded. If you put everybody in a context where generally speaking, being moral is not beneficial, I really highly doubt people are going to be moral when it's not beneficial. It only is this way because this is the situation we're in. I think that's an adequate explanation.
Well, I think that a lot of people won't be immoral if it's not beneficial to them. I think for a lot of people, it depends very much on the specific circumstances. And then I think there are lots of people who are happy who will be moral even if it makes their life predictably worse.
Does the idea of being moral, being a moral person, yield pleasure? Because in my opinion, it does. Feeling like I'm a good person, that makes me feel good, right? And that's the reason why I like it. If being a good person made me feel bad, I wouldn't be a good person. And so even whenever you make decisions that like in the material sense are not in your interest, they can still be in the psychological sense, at least in your perception of what your interest is.
I mean, I don't have that much money to donate, but I donate some money to organizations that have no emotional resonance with me, that are working on reducing existential.
You feel like a good person, don't you? Right?
Well, no, I don't really. I don't like. I'm not made happier when I'm made happier when I donate to various organizations that matter to me, like organizations preventing animal torture. But there are many organizations that I think are good for utilitarian reasons, but that just don't make me happy to donate to.
I've never donated to an organization that where in the process I haven't felt better about myself, or I haven't felt like, oh, I'm a good person, or this is really nice. Some people are going to be helped by this. That makes me feel nice. And I really doubt anybody would donate anything to anyone if the process of doing so, not only, I guess, didn't make them feel good, but made them feel bad, right? And that's why, I guess we kind of assume neutrality in many cases whenever the kind of pleasure is not kind of defined how it usually is. Like what benefits us is usually defined in very raw material terms. And so we say, oh, I'm neutral whenever I donate to somebody. I don't think that's true. I think there is a real experiential pleasure that you yield in those situations.
I mean, that's certainly so. Okay, it's certainly true that there are some cases in which it donating produces pleasure. But I mean, if I gave $5 to in person to some organization that's asking for funds to, I don't know, do some important thing, that would make me a decent amount happier than if I donated to the Machine Intelligence Research Institute, which is working on AI alignment. And yet, I donate some. Well, I don't think I donate to MIRI actually, but I donate some to long-termist organizations that have no that don't emotionally resonate with me, and that certainly emotionally resonate with me.
I mean, like I said, Matthew, it's if you're gonna just speak purely about like your decision making, it's gonna be very hard for me to say, actually, no, I have a better understanding of your decision making than you do, right? This is something that is supposed to be a theory about. This is the problem with any sort of theory about human motivation. We can all summon anecdotes and say, well, actually, I think this is I just don't feel like this is true. And here's an example in my case. I think that your case, the example you brought to me is perfectly explicable, from this framework. I think it's perfectly explicable. I really actually doubt there could be another explanation for that decision. I don't think that humans are just motivated by some sort of raw, completely removed from emotion interest in what is the socially or effectively altruistic behavior. I wish we were, but we're not. We need to feel something. We need to feel good when we do good things. And I think that's part of the reason why we're pro-social creatures, because we feel good when we do good things. I think if you remove those social elements, is present in many other species, where they don't feel so good whenever they do pro-social things. They don't do so many pro-social things. And I don't think you see many sociopaths making similar donations. Why? Because they're devoid of kind of the pro-social elements that we have in our psychology.
Well, actually, there was a case I read about where there was some sociopath who just, and this is pretty cool, but this sociopath just donated lots to effective charities because they were just convinced by the philosophical arguments. They were just convinced by Parfit that that there's no morally salient, that there's no salient distinction between them and other people, and so it would be irrational for them to care about their future self.
Even in this case, I think the value of this theory is that like it's robust enough to explain pretty much all human action that I've ever been able to think about. You could say, well, it doesn't seem very intuitive in every case, and that's fair enough, right? Any sort of kind of comprehensive theory of human action is going to seem pretty difficult. It's going to seem not very intuitive because human action is very diverse. But in that case, people, this person, values being rational. They have a positive association with rationality. Rationality is something that we generally have a positive association with. That's why we value it, because it helps us interact with the world in a way that brings us pleasure, right? If I was very irrational, I would not understand that whenever I turn the doorknob, the door opens. I would understand that when I flick the switch, the light turns on. I might think that maybe God does it. And I do chants ceaselessly and very unsuccessfully until the light turns on, only to one day realize that I could just use my rational faculties and that would make my life much easier. So people can have a value for rationality that they can kind of lead themselves to having tons of other kind of far off effects from that.
I mean, it's always possible to tell a just so story about how, this thing that seems to be motivated altruistically is really being done because it produces pleasure in some way. And then it's always possible to point to how either the act itself or some motivation behind the act produced pleasure at some point. But when psychological hedonism becomes, sufficiently broad to be able to explain, to just say, every time any person takes any action, you can just point to somewhere in the process where something brought them pleasure and say, aha, that explains it. I mean, you can do this. It seems like you could do this with any theory. So here's one theory. Let's say, so this theory says that people's sole motivation is to gain knowledge. And then every time you have a case where, so I mean, then they could, if you ask like, well, what about a case where a person, could gain more knowledge or could also, just have a fun time at the beach? Why don't people always spend time at the beach? They would say, well, time spent at the beach, people can learn things at the beach. They can learn important lessons from their friends. I mean, it's always possible to tell a just so story, but it seems really implausible that every time people are acting, they're doing it and they're trying to maximize their own pleasure.
Well, I mean, I guess the issue that you're bringing up here is that this is basically an area where any theory is effectively unfalsifiable, effectively speaking, because we really just can't know. I think this is the most plausible. And I think that given that you accept kind of the hedonic premise that like goodness is definable by the experiential state of pleasure and badness is definable by the experiential state of suffering, that this would be somewhat intuitive to you. Like you kind of understand that, when preference, like goodness and badness are assertions of preference. They're usually assertions of preference at the social level. And so like our assertions of preference at the individual level are probably very heavily related to experiential pleasure and suffering in some sort of way.
Just to be clear, I'm not making an assertion of preference at the level of either individuals or society. I'm not making a claim about what actually motivates people. The claim is about what's worth pursuing. And I think that, so I'm a moral realist. I think.
Well, so what's worth pursuing? I think that's interesting, right? Like to me, philosophy and like ethics has to appeal to us. That's to make a rational case to us on why we should believe in it. Like, I should believe in this sort of theory because it gives me something that I want probably already. You can't convince me, I guess. Like you could convince me I want something, but it would have to be associated with some sort of base desire, right? So I don't really see how, if we have like this kind of motivation that's basically undescribable. I mean, it's just a mix of like an infinite number of different things that's kind of always changing and different per person. How you could ever make any sort of consistent case to anybody that they should believe in your specific philosophy? You don't even know what they want.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what they want, but what I think is worthwhile isn't dependent on what people want. So, I mean, I think, and I agree that philosophy should in general be useful, though often philosophy will be useful in indirect ways. So the debate about Platonism versus nominalism, that doesn't have any direct practical benefits to anyone. But I think that that philosophy is not just about getting what we want. There are things that we can want that we shouldn't want. So here's a classic example given by Derek Parfit. Let's imagine that a person has a desire for they care about their pleasure and pain except on future Tuesdays. So when it's a future Tuesday, they don't care what happens to them. And in fact, so they're given a choice. They can either experience infinite torture on a Tuesday or a pinprick on Monday. They'll take the infinite torture on Tuesday because they just don't care about what happens to them on Tuesday. Well, even though what they want is to suffer on Tuesday, and bear in mind, what they want is to suffer on Tuesday. It seems like they're being irrational. That's not what they should want. Now, just one misconception to clear up. It's not that that on Tuesday they actually enjoy the suffering. It's that they have a meta desire for just not caring about what happens to them on Tuesday. And so we can stipulate that while it's Tuesday, they're hypnotized to believe it's Monday. And so they experience the suffering just as they would if they were tortured on Monday. They just have a higher ordered desire, like indifference to suffering on Tuesday.
I mean, I think this is one of those cases where like a philosophical example, like a thought experiment, just assumes away like an aspect of reality and then uses that to derive a conclusion that is like extremely not intuitive. So like, assume for a second that killing babies is actually good, then killing babies would be actually good, right? Assume for a second that you don't care about your suffering on Tuesdays. What do you mean I don't like? Okay, just assume something that I do care about. Nobody cares about anymore. And then, wow, look, you don't care about suffering on Tuesdays. I mean, like, okay, I mean, I don't really know how profound that is.
I'm not assuming that you don't care about it. I'm assuming that we can imagine a hypothetical agent who doesn't care about it. And this is clearly true.
I can't. I cannot imagine a hypothetical agent that that just completely has no preference. If they have a full understanding that they're going to completely suffer on Tuesdays, like that has no preference for maybe having pleasure on Tuesdays in that day. So, it seems very infeasible.
I mean, I'd make a couple of points. One of them is that this doesn't seem any more irrational than like many of our existing attitudes towards time. So people tend to care much more about events that happen to them in the near future, rather than the far future. People are willing to procrastinate even if they, it'll be detrimental to their long.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like a neurological aspect to that for sure, right?
Well, I agree, but couldn't you imagine an agent who has a neurological mechanism to not caring about their suffering on Tuesday? So let's imagine that the following was true. Let's imagine that that there was. Let's make it not, rather than future Tuesday indifference, let's make it full moon indifference. Well, we could imagine some organisms that evolved for there to be, lots of dangers on the full moon, such that they like never went out on the full moon, and then that was really bad. And so like the only time they could reproduce was on the full moon for some reason. And so as a result, they slowly over time evolved to like just not care what happens to them on a full moon. I mean, it seems perfectly possible to imagine there's a possible evolutionary story about how this would happen. But I mean, people can have all sorts of bizarre pathologies and desires. There doesn't seem to be anything incomprehensible about that.
I mean, well, I think the Tuesday one is very impractical. I'm not so sure about the moon one. I guess it still seems like that doesn't have too much to do with people's calculations of like, or value of their experiential pleasure. I mean, maybe you want to stay inside when it's a full moon. I don't really think that you stop caring that you're suffering on that day.
Well,
and that you just have no preference any which way.
but
But I mean, just to
what's inconceivable about a scenario in which you don't care about your suffering on a full moon or on a future Tuesday? I agree that, it's probably psychologically, like, you couldn't have a human like this, maybe, just for psychological facts about us. But we could
well, we're
certainly
talking about
imagine.
humans, right? We're talking about like human motivation and trying to understand how we act, trying to understand what we want, so we can kind of make some discoveries here.
Well, I
To
don't.
me,
I don't think we're just trying to decide what we want. We're also trying to decide whether or not wanting something is sufficient for giving a person a reason to pursue that thing.
I don't think you're going to do things you don't want to do.
So I agree that you won't do things that you don't want to do.
So,
But
I
if
mean,
you
you could
think
say like you shouldn't do something that you want to do, and not want just in like the very surfacey sense, but like in a very like deep sense. You could say you shouldn't do it, but if somebody really wants to do it way more than any other wants, they're going to do the thing, right? They're going to do the thing they want most.
I agree that people will do what they desire to do, but
Yeah.
also, so not all. Well, a couple of points to make about that. One, not all desires are self-directed. So even though you may have a desire for your, so you might say something like, you may have a desire for harming yourself to help your friend, even though you know that that would make your life go well. But the more important point, I think, is that even though people will do what they desire, that doesn't show that they ought to do what they desire.
Yeah, but I think oughts, we kind of get into a very like definitionally complex area with that, and hopefully you can give me a little moment, because you kind of said a lot of stuff that I want to respond to adequately. So when it comes to ought specifically, I think usually when we use the word ought and we talk about like normative ethics, good and bad, we're just talking about social preference. So we take an aggregate of individual utilities, the people that we consider to be included within society, people whose like interests actually matter, which changes all the time. And then we say what's in the aggregate interest, what's not, what's against the aggregate interest. And that's why it changes a lot. Normative ethics changes all the time. I mean, there's also religious elements here if we ignore the kind of religious elements, because that can make things slightly more complex, but that's a whole other subject. I don't think that the ought matters unless it's connected to any sort of utility calculations. Let me give you an example, right? You can tell me that I should do this thing that is moral. I should follow this moral rule. If it doesn't benefit me, I'm not going to listen. But you can convince a critical mass of people, hopefully, that this moral rule is so important and so beneficial that it should be enforced. And if this is, usually probably a majority, you're making an appeal based on the kind of the aggregate interest in order to appeal to as many people as possible, then it will become something that is enforced. It can be enforced culturally, or it can be enforced through laws. And I think that is generally the process by which we're talking about ethics. We're talking about it from a social lens, which does not mean that on the individual level in each instance, it's something that is kind of objectively correct for me. I should objectively do this, because sometimes what's in the social interest is not what I want most and not what I will do, even if I'm being rational.
Yeah, so I disagree that ought is just social preference. And I don't think that ought is just about the aggregate interest. So lots of people think, you have lots of deontologists who think that what you ought to do is not what is in the aggregate interest. And I think that they're substantively mistaken about what you ought to do, but they're not misusing the term ought. They're just wrong about what things.
Well, it's irrelevant. No, it's just, no, I'm saying they can use that, but it's just completely irrelevant, because if it's not related to anybody's interest, no one's ever going to do it, right? You can say it's completely immoral for people to, okay, let's try to think, eat food. It's completely immoral to eat food. You can say I've deontologically derived that with all my axioms and whatever. It doesn't matter. It's completely irrelevant, because everybody wants to eat food.
Well, so I think that you can have a moral prescription even if nobody is motivated to follow it. But also, lots of people are motivated to follow deontological prescriptions. So, lots of people, for example, think that it would be wrong to kill one person to save a dozen.
Because they're convinced that doing what is ethically correct benefits them in some sort of way. If you produce a philosophy, or a set of like metaphysically true rules about the universe, and then you can't convince me in any which way that actually following these rules is going to have any sort of benefit at all, or even appeal to kind of my biases and my preferences and my the things I've derived to be loosely associated with my pleasure, I'm not going to listen to you, right? You have to appeal to something. You have to convince me. You have to appeal to something I want. If you can't do that, I'm not going to believe you. And that's the general theory. People do what they want, and so in order to convince them of a certain theory, it has to be related to what they want. Sometimes what's correct socially is not going to be what each individual wants, but it will be in the interest of a powerful enough group of people that they can actually assert that through some sort of social means.
I agree that that people do what they want, but I don't think that what they want is necessarily selfishly motivated.
Well, I didn't say that.
Lots of people. I think lots of people. In lots of cases, people. So I don't think that morality is just about getting what people want, because people may have desires that are not directed towards people getting mostly what they want. So in the case of the deontologist might say that even if they benefited from that, even if they got more of what they wanted from killing one person to save five, and by virtue of saving five, other people got more of what they wanted. Even if that were the case, they would still have a desire not to kill one person to save five.
Because they think they've been convinced that being ethical and following this ethical system is beneficial. It's something they want. They want to follow this ethical system.
Well, you can't make so beneficial and something that they want are two totally distinct things. I agree that that people will only act on an ethical system if they desire to act on the ethical system, but people will often act on ethical systems that don't benefit them.
Do I want things that are not desirable? For me, I perceive something as not desirable, but I want it anyway.
You perceive something as not desirable, but you want it.
Is that possible?
Well, I think that is possible. So you might, if what we mean by desirable is worth desiring, then you might think.
No, not from in my perspective. In my perspective, so I want this thing, and desirable. These are completely synonymous terms. That was a question that I'd hope you'd be pretty easy. It's not desirable from the social perspective, this like enlightened scientist in the background that doesn't have to necessarily agree with me that this is something I should want, but I desire what I want, right? And things I desire are desirable, which means they yield something that I desire, that I want. And so the entire argument in this article is that what we desire, we have positive associations with, which is almost like so obviously correct with how I define positive associations to be. I mean, frankly, it goes without saying, right? And then it says positive associations is just about a kind of neurological association with experiences, which is kind of just a very simple evolutionary point, right? We're evolutionarily programmed to do things like pleasure is supposed to be associated with activities that have positive survival effects, and pain is associated with things that have negative survival effects. And so this is the motivation system that evolution gave us in order to promote the behaviors that would help us survive, right? Well, and so like just connecting each go ahead, sorry.
Well, I would agree that one of our motivations is certainly the pursuit of pleasure. Most people, most of the time, desire pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Though I don't think that that's our only motivation, and I think you agree that that's not our only motivation. Now, you think that our other motivations may be caused in some way by conditioning for pleasure and pain. But regardless of the causal story of how we got those desires, we have desires for things other than our pleasure and pain. But I want to just return for a moment to your point about ought not mattering if it's not connected to utility calculations, and about how nobody will care about what they ought to do if it doesn't accord with their desires. So I think that a helpful analogy here is with epistemic justification. So while it's true that nobody will believe things unless they think they have most reason to do it, to believe them, there's actually a difference between what it's rational for you to believe and what you actually believe. And that's true even though what you actually believe ends up being the same as what you think you rationally ought to believe.
I understand, yeah. But I would just a quick thing, even though I didn't think you were done. Isn't rationality a means to an end?
It depends on what you mean by that.
So if I want to get to like the other side of a river, right, I can be rational in getting there, right? But rationality can't tell me where I'm trying to go. That's the Izot gap, right?
Well, no, I think rationality can tell you where it's worth going. Now, I don't think that so the Izot gap says that you can't get a knot from purely descriptive claims, but I don't think that claims about what it's reasonable to desire are purely descriptive claims.
So I mean, we could say that like you want this thing. This is something that you like intrinsically want, and this is the thing that you really want. And so this is how we rationally get to helping satisfy that thing, right? You can't like rationalize somebody into saying like, oh, well, you don't want this thing, and it's actually not related to any sort of base want that you have. But rationally speaking, you definitely should. Completely irrelevant that you don't actually, in any sort of sense, want it.
Well, no, I think that we can do that. I mean,
really?
I think that, yeah, I think there are cases in which you can talk people into wanting things. An appeal to rational argument, arguing that people should want things. So I think it's important to clarify exactly what we mean by desire. So desire in one sense is just what people have the psychological inclination for. So you might use desire to describe just sort of what people like. So but what I'm using desire in a deeper sense of what one is ultimately aiming for. And I think that there are lots of just worthless things that one might be aiming for. So a person might only be aiming for increasing human well-being, but in fact, you can convince them that what they should be aiming for is caring about all well-being. Also, a person, I mean, in a case where, in the future Tuesday indifference case that I gave earlier, a person is aiming for.
Wait, can we just stick to that example though? Actually, in the case of like convincing somebody to change their mind, never was my point. I hope it didn't come off this way. You can't change people's minds, or that you can't make things.
To be clear, I wasn't saying that was what you're.
Yeah, that you can't desire something. You can't make somebody desire something different. But if you removed it from anything they did desire, right? They're like, in no way can you connect anything they desire to this thing. Can you convince them to want it or desire it? I don't really think so. And I think in the case of like convincing somebody to value animal lives equal to or somewhat more than nothing, like equal to human lives, is a great example, because usually the way you go about doing that is you say, well, we have this value system for humans, look at it. We value humans. All humans are created equal. This is very positive. This is something that we're kind of like socially programmed to believe, right? And there's like, look, if we don't believe this way and we use a different thought process, it leads to all these bad conclusions. It leads to like genocide, and we have negative associations with that, blah, 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 blah. Well, actually, look, there's an inconsistency in this argument. And actually, if you get down to the root of it, in order to consistently apply it, we actually have to value animals too, blah, 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 blah. We value consistency. That's why it makes sense. If we didn't value consistency, we say, oh, consistency completely doesn't matter. It's completely irrelevant. And you can't convince me. There's no way you can convince me consistency doesn't matter. Does matter. Well, then that argument's not going to be very good, right? And so that was my entire point, that if there was no way that you could connect this thing to anything I actually do genuinely desire, or any sort of base desire that I have, well, you can't convince me. You can't logic me in there. You have to appeal to some sort of desire that I have in order to get me to move and agree with you and find whatever you think is desirable as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure that that's correct. Like in the case given earlier of the sociopath who was convinced by Parfit-style arguments to be charitable.
Does he not value what's rational?
Well, Well, okay. I mean, I guess you can always push it back a level and then ask, well, if you care about, well, I mean, maybe he does value what's rational, but
I think he values what's rational, and I think it's because you could demonstrate, like I told you with the light switch and everything. But there's plenty of other examples in which we can have an affinity for rationality, and that can lead us to certain conclusions. Now, I think that it's kind of hard to enter into normative ethics with like absolutely no kind of social interest, and then like come to some really pro-social conclusions, because you have to start with something. In the case of like this hedonic naturalism thing, you just start with your own interests and you build out from there because you have that, and you reason your way into a bunch of different positions. When it comes to like some sort of objective, non-subject relative ethics, I really don't see how you do that. I guess you have to start with some sort of axiom and build out there, and you kind of have to just assume that axiom, right?
Yeah. So I mean, it's true that we have to assume the axiom, but that's true of all knowledge. If you keep asking how you know things, you'll appeal to a previous claim, and you can keep asking how we know it until you just get down to foundational bedrock, and then you get just very obvious claims. But you can do the same with morality. So you ask how. I mean, I think morality is analogous to something like math in this sentence. So you ask how we know mathematical things. You reduce it to a bunch of axioms. Then we just assume that those axioms are true. Because the axioms are just very obvious. I think that the same thing is true of morality. So you ask how we know moral things, we get back to various principles, and then we get down to foundational bedrock. So we get to the conclusion that suffering is bad, and then that's just trivially obvious.
Well, it's truly obvious because we don't like it. We don't like suffering, right? Suffering is bad, and actually, in many ways, bad is suffering. That is like the entire kind of inherent to the concept of it, I think. And so, good is like pleasure, and like those are like just definitional like constants.
I don't think. Sorry to cut you off, which is I don't think that that pleasure and good are the same thing. I think that pleasure has the substantive property of being good.
I'm not saying they're at a point where you can just substitute them in all cases and it's true. But I'm saying what is good because it has characteristics of bringing about pleasure. That's the reason why we perceive it to be such.
Well, I would agree with that, but you said definitionally, and
it's like inherent, and it's inherent to the concept of good.
I don't think it's inherent. Well, it depends on exactly what you mean by that. So consider the following analogy. Water is H2O. Water is not H2O. Like it's not true in virtue of the meanings of the terms or anything like that. It's a substantive claim that we discovered that the thing that is water is made up of.
I mean, that's like a definitional. I guess I'm saying inherent to what we consider good is the fact that it can bring about pleasure, or at least it's thought to bring about pleasure, and that's like irremovable from it. Good in this case is just preference. We prefer it. Good is things that we prefer. Those are like the same thing.
I don't think that good is the things that we prefer, and I don't think that we only prefer pleasure. I think that there are just clear counterexamples to the notion that good is just what we prefer.
Well, it's not always what we prefer at the individual level. And remember, one of the reasons why these ethical discussions can get really super messy is because like we assume different perspectives throughout them. We can assume individual perspectives. We can assume social perspectives. We can assume like metaphysical, like all of life perspectives. And so like sometimes one definition is going to contradict another, and that's not a contradiction in the idea that I'm trying to articulate. It's just assuming different perspectives and reaching different conclusions from those different perspectives.
Yeah, so I think we need to be precise here. So if the claim, so what do you mean exactly by the social perspective?
The social perspective is the aggregated interest of included subjects.
Okay, so do you think that good is the social perspective by definition?
I think words mean what we use them to mean. I think usually whenever we're talking about good and bad, we're assuming some sort of aggregate. It's not always the same aggregate. It differs based on individuals, but it's usually the social interest. I think that's usually what people are talking about. Now, they don't always reach these conclusions in the same way. They don't always say, well, actually, I'm doing some sort of consequentialist utility calculation. But as you argued, very, very well, and your utilitarianism wins outright series, a lot of times those things are just connected to utility, but people don't recognize it, right? So I don't think we disagree on this, really.
Well, I think we do, actually. So
I think you want to disagree. I think you just
but I mean, so in the case of good, I don't think that, like, I don't think that it's good is just by definition the social perspective, with varying degrees of sociality. Because if that were true, then the utilitarian claim would be true by definition. But I don't think that it's true by definition. I think that the person who asserts that utilitarianism is false isn't misusing words. I think that they're just wrong about what things are good.
I think they misunderstand the general reasons why we perceive what is good to be good, and the reasons why we perceive what is bad to be bad, and so that can lead them to faulty conclusions. But that doesn't change why we consider good and bad, because we associate it with positive experiences, negative experiences. I mean, we can give like 1,000 instances in which this is true, right? The reason why we perceive, some people could say stealing is wrong because it just is, because of some sort of axiom that I have. And we'd be like, not really. The reason why we perceive stealing to be bad is because it hurts people, and it makes, if everybody was stealing all the time, that'd be really bad. And so we kind of considered it to be a negative thing. And so we can create legal justifications, and people have created religious justifications a lot of times for kind of their consequentialistic calculations, but it doesn't change the fact that the reason why stealing is bad is because it harms people, and that's the reason why we generally think it's bad. If stealing made everybody happy and every time somebody stole, everybody's life got way better, clearly I don't think anybody would be asserting it's bad.
Well, I mean, I think some people would, but I agree that. So in the case of stealing, I think that people will think that that part of the reason why stealing is bad is because it causes harm. But I don't think that explains the entire reason why most people think it's bad. So lots of people have the intuition that if you steal a loaf of bread to feed your starving family, lots of people have the intuition that that's wrong, even though that's clearly beneficial overall. And lots of people have the intuition that people just have inalienable rights that you shouldn't violate, even if violating them would be good.
No, for sure. I mean, I don't disagree with that at all. I mean, that'd be ludicrous to disagree with that. Not everybody agrees with me, but I'm saying the reason why they think the way they do is because of some sort of associations, right? So in both of these, it makes perfect sense, right? People have a perception that stealing is bad, and they think stealing is very bad. Sometimes it's for religious reasons, and then so now they kind of lose the plot, the reason why we'd even consider it bad in the first place. They can also consider rights to be things that are really valuable, and so we should just universally apply them, and they can reach wrong ethical conclusions. The point is, at the beginning of the day, the reason why anybody considered that to be bad and this thing to be good is because of the effects it had on our actual experiences in terms of how, whether they were good or positive or negative. And I think that's fully defensible. And I really I feel like the argument I'm making right now is like very, very much in line with what you articulated in your articles. It might be semantically slightly different, but I don't think it's substantively different.
Just to be clear, so what I claim in the article is at various points is that I think that the things that seem valuable to us are not necessarily the things that are actually valuable. And so we can, if something tends to promote value, then we'll tend to think that it's valuable. And so that explains lots of our intuitions about things that nearly always promote utility, why those tend to be good. So that's the claim that I would make in the article. I think that the area where we disagree is, well, one, I think we disagree about whether people's motivations are necessarily about their own pleasure. I think that people can have motivations that have nothing to do with their own pleasure. So, but then I think that the other area of disagreement is that, um, so I think that I'm not sure that the account that says that it's through psychological conditioning or like conditioning through pleasure and pain is very plausible. I think there's certainly sometimes some conditioning through pleasure and pain, though I don't think that can explain how we acquire all of our distinctly moral judgments. And if the claim is that and then the third thing that I think we disagree about is whether morality is, by definition, what fulfills society's preferences, or whether we think that morality is this vague term about just what we should pursue, and then.
Well, I think morality means, many different things to many different people. I think that whenever we're trying to pursue like ethics, we want something like ethics is valuable to us because it brings us value. It does something useful for us. I think that's the reason why we value it. I don't think we would do it if it didn't bring any value to us. And I think at the social level, it's like very necessary. And I think generally our considerations for what is bad and what is good are based on some sort of relationship to our actual experiences, whether those are positive or negative. I think that's not like really too controversial. Now, I know we disagree on what motivates action. You seem to think that
Sorry,
there's.
you cut out for a bit.
Oh,
Can you repeat
shoot.
that?
Unfortunate. I'm kind of starting a new thing where I'm saying, I know that you disagreed with me on what motivates human action. I'm actually just curious to hear what you think is the most kind of convincing theory about a comprehensive model of human motivation. If you say there's none, I'm going to be very disappointed.
Oh, I don't think that there's going to be. Well, I don't think that there's going to be a simple reductive model any more than I think that. Humans are these very, very complicated organisms. We have a wide array of different desires, many of them self-oriented, many of them directed towards pleasure, many of them other-oriented, many directed towards just our interest, many of them not directed towards our interest. I don't think that there's a simple, comprehensive underlying account of human motivation.
That's unfortunate. I think the reason why this theory is convincing to me is because it just seems to make a lot of sense from an evolutionary perspective. But I think I think whenever a consciousness emerges in a creature, it is not operating purely off of kind of subconscious decision making. There needs to be some sort of way that evolution exerts its influence, like its capacity to kind of guide our decisions. And so I think it does that through pleasure. And I think it does that through pain as well. And so that is the ultimate guide that evolution has bestowed upon us to guide our decisions towards what will, historically speaking, helped us survive. And so I think all of our behaviors make sense from that very simple perspective. And I think when you look at people like neurologically, I think that you can connect their decision making to certain neurochemical substances like dopamine, like serotonin, like oxytocin, things that we know people enjoy when they experience, and certain hormones that we know that cause pain, that cause the experience of pain. And I think we can really just take that descriptive state of how humans operate and say, okay, well, when we look at human decision making, it must be because of some sort of association with the things that evolution has given us to guide our decision making. I don't know. Maybe it's wrong.
Yeah, so I think that the evolutionary story. So one, I think that this will raise some deeper questions, but I'm really skeptical of accounts that, like, I think it's very difficult to tell that we don't really know very much about the causal role played by consciousness. I think that there are viable theories on which consciousness doesn't actually do anything. A theory that says that is called epiphenomenalism. And that may sound initially crazy, and it did to me at first too, but it turns out that various considerations of consciousness get very strange. But bracketing out those for a moment, I think that evolution can motivate us through pleasure and pain, but evolution can also just directly give us motivations. So we can just evolve to have a motivation for various things. I don't know.
I think the mechanism. I feel like the mechanism by which it does so seems to be pleasure and pain. But I mean, we could probably talk about this point ad infinitum. So I'm interested in two things before we call it a night. First, I'd like to explain what you mean by it doesn't do anything. That seems kind of loaded. What do you mean? Like, what do you mean? Like, is consciousness fake, or what? I don't really know if consciousness is supposed to do something.
So I think consciousness is real, but I think it's plausible. And I don't, this is not the view that I lean towards, but I think it's minimally plausible that consciousness does not cause anything. But
like, what would it cause?
You having, well, if you think that pleasure and pain are what are changing our behavior, then you have to think that the conscious state of being in pleasure causes us to act in some physical state.
Yes, I think what goes on in our brain does affect our decisions and like our physical.
Well, I agree that what goes. So just to be clear on this model, the physical would cause the mental, but the mental would not cause the physical. So our brain.
I think the mental is part of the physical.
Yeah, so I disagree with that.
You don't think that like your brain is a physical, like your mental state is part of your physical brain?
Well, no. And
well, that's unfortunate.
Well, just to be clear, I think it's caused by your physical brain. And so I think changes to your physical brain will bring about changes to your consciousness. But I have an article on this called Against Dogmatic Physicalism that I'll link in the chat. And I had very physicalist intuitions at first. I think that, at first I just assumed that believing that there's this, that consciousness is not just physical, that believing that consciousness is just physical, I thought that it was just this sort of hippie idea or religious idea. But it actually turns out that, something like 30% of philosophers reject physicalism about consciousness, while only 50% accept it. And there are lots of
only 50%?
50% accept it, 30%.
Well, I'll take those odds. In philosophy, that's actually quite good because you look at most fields and they're like, you can't get much higher than 35%. So I'll take a W for my team.
It's 50% to 30%. But so, I mean, there are various reasons to think. So one reason to think that consciousness is not physical and it is that consciousness is clearly caused by the physical, and maybe it causes physical things too. But if you look at, so what you get out of physics is you get explanations in terms of structure and function. So you get an explanation of the way that matter behaves, but no part of explaining how matter behaves will ever explain what it's like to be in a particular brain state, or why there's anything that it's like to be in a particular brain state. So, and what we get out of neuroscience is we just get correlations. So what we see is that there's this particular physical arrangement, and then there's this conscious state. But there's the conscious state is whole. There's no way of figuring out what the consciousness state is only by knowing the physical arrangement. That's not true of other purely physical things. So, for example, you can know all the facts about water by knowing all the facts about hydrogen and oxygen and how they interact. But even if you knew all the facts,
isn't there emergent properties? Like that's a consistently real thing. There's emergent properties. Out of complexity comes, out of certain things comes complexities that did not exist prior. So like a hydrogen atom and a oxygen, these things cannot do, what they can do as when combined independently. So I don't see how you could just look at oxygen, hydrogen, and derive and understand everything that you understand about water.
Yeah,
It seems like there's an emergent property there in the substance of water when those things come together, right?
yeah, so there are two types of emergence. One of them is weak emergence, one of them is strong emergence. So weak emergence involves some lower level thing, the way that it interacts, when it interacts, that generates some higher level phenomena. So there are no red atoms, but you have atoms that collectively comprise a red thing. But in the case of so but if you knew all the facts about the atoms and their positions and so on, you would know about what the color, the red, that the thing was red. But if you knew all the facts,
Is that correlation? Like you don't
um,
know that just by looking. You just know that whenever you put them together that way, it ends up being red. So that's what you know. But it's an emergent thing, right? And so when you put all the cells in our brain together, all their component parts, well, now you have consciousness. Why does
well,
that happen? I don't know.
so
It's correlation, right?
no, so it's not just correlation. In that, if you knew all the physical facts, in theory, you could figure out all the lower order physical facts about atoms. In theory, you could figure out that the thing would be red. But if you knew all the lower level physical facts about atoms, that wouldn't allow you to, even in theory, tell about what conscious states are correlated with which brain states. So the weak emergence is where these get into some sort of complicated issues in philosophy of mind, which we could discuss, but that is taking us rather far afield to from a psychological means. So I'd be happy to continue discussing. It's up to you.
Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to look more into the kind of anti-physicalist world. That's why I'm an econ major. Everything's a lot more straightforward. I guess I would want to hear your kind of case for your utilitarianism from an objective perspective, and see if I run into any problems where I feel like there's like a non sequitur or something doesn't make sense to me, because I really don't understand the objective case. I've heard some of the arguments for it, but all of them seem pretty implausible to me.
Yeah. So I think that basically there are various. So the way it makes sense to think about things is we'll consider various claims and then figure out which of them are the most plausible. And so if a claim seems really plausible to us, we have no good reason to reject it, and we should accept the claim. And so there are various ways of deriving utilitarianism from plausible axioms. So, and then there are various arguments for the axioms. So here's one way. So it seems like what morality is fundamentally about is what we would care about if we were fully rational and impartial. So every time you say someone's being immoral, what you're saying is some combination of, you're being selfish in some way, or you're not caring about the right thing.
Wait, so is that like kind of working backwards from how we define morality usually? Like,
yeah. So I think that this is the best definition of morality. Morality denotes morality, I think, denotes what we have most impartial reason to care about, which is the same thing as what we would care about if we were fully rational.
so I have a question. Why should I care about morality?
Well, so it's trivial that what you should care about is what you rationally should care about, right?
Like, why is it rational for me to care about morality?
Well, remember, so morality has two components. One of them is what you would care about if you were rational, and then of them. So morality is what we'd care about if we were rational and impartial. Figuring out why we should care about the rationality part, that's very straightforward. Because why should you care about what it's rational for you to care about? Because it's rational for you to care about it. But in terms of the impartiality, well, I think that there are arguments that. So one thing is that I think that moral realism could be true, even if people weren't rationally required to be to adopt the correct morality. So for a long time, what I believed is that rationality doesn't tell you whether you should be moral or self-interested. What you morally should do is what the moral thing is to do. But what rationality doesn't tell you whether you should be moral or self-interested. That'll just depend on your desires. But I've abandoned that view, and I can explain why I've abandoned that view. But that view is perfectly compatible.
Okay, wait, yeah, that was just confusing to me because you said morality is just what you would pursue if you were being rational.
No, so morality is what you would care about if
you're unbiased and you're consistent,
rational, and impartial.
Yeah. So I don't really understand still why we need to be impartial, but I mean, this is a very interesting definition of morality. I'm writing it down so I can kind of make sure I substitute this in. Could you actually just substitute in for morality every time what we would pursue if we were rational? Just because I feel like this term is very messy and impartial. Yeah, you can say that as well. But yeah, why should we be impartial again?
Actually, so just to be clear, I don't think that you have to say that rationality requires us to be impartial to be a moral realist. But I think the reason that we should be impartial is that I think that so this will be a multi-step argument. So let's start with the following claim. Future Tuesday indifference is irrational. That seems pretty plausible. If you don't care about what happens to yourself in the future, that seems irrational. And so then the question is, why is it rational to care about yourself or to not care about, why is it irrational to not care about yourself on future Tuesdays, but not irrational to not care about other people? And so you might say, well, because you'll be the one experiencing it. And then you can symmetrically say, well, because other people will be the ones experiencing it. So the same reasons that count in favor of...
so it's this argument. It's like the self is like fake, right? Like, so your future like consciousness is like basically the same as like other people's consciousnesses.
Well, this actually doesn't rely on thinking that the self is fake, but I think that the self being fake does make the argument even more decisive. So I think that even if we don't think that the self is fake, if the distinction between our future selves and other people is just as arbitrary as not caring about yourself on a future Tuesday, then it's unclear.
I'm sorry, I don't understand that at all. Like it doesn't. So I mean, this is not something that we do. Like this is kind of an example that doesn't make any sense. We care about ourselves we think it's irrational for us to not care about ourselves on future Tuesdays because we do care about ourselves on future Tuesdays. We just do. Like we totally do. There's like irreconcilably, like we do. We care about we care about pleasure. We want
I don't think that's true. So there are lots of things that we do care about, but that we don't think rationally we should care about. So people do procrastinate, even though it doesn't seem like they rationally should procrastinate.
That's reconcilable, right? You can change that behavior. You can't change the behavior that I care about my pleasure. Can you convince me to, internally speaking, to not have any preference, even subconsciously, for experiences of pleasure over pain?
No, I mean, I think that I think it's a psychological fact about humans. They tend to prefer pleasure to pain.
Of course, right?
Yeah.
So so I care about my pleasure, like consciously, but like subconsciously I inherently do, right? And so I may not be super consistent with how I apply this each day, but I do. Like on a Tuesday, I'm still going to care if I'm suffering, and I'm still going to care if I'm experiencing wellness, and I just do. Like that's just true. Do I care if you experience like pleasure or pain like on another day or any other sort of subject? Like maybe a little bit, maybe like peripherally, some sort of subject that I'll never know, that I don't even know about, like that's completely separate? Probably not, right? That's kind of how it is. You can say, well, I mean, it's arbitrary that you care about yourself and that you don't care about other people. I mean, I think that's a very strange way to use arbitrary. I think that's just kind of inherent to how we exist as biological creatures.
Well, so even if it's true that what we do care about is ourselves and not other people, or other people less, there's a distinct, so as the future Tuesday indifference case shows, there's a difference between what we do care about and what we should care about. But I don't think that the fact that you can change whether or not you procrastinate, I mean, like just people have a preference for people would rather suffering happen in the future rather than near. They would rather pleasure happen to them near rather than in the future. Yeah, that seems like an irrational preference. It seems arbitrary and not justified. So the claim is that the caring about ourselves rather than others would be, in the same sense, irrational, arbitrary, and unjustified. And so the question would be what this. So if you doubt that there are irrational desires, well, here's one very clear case of an irrational.
I don't doubt that there's irrational desires.
Okay, so you agree that people can have an ultimate aim and that they can be wrong to ultimately aim at that.
The ultimate aim, I think there's a base desire and there's other desires that are kind of connected to this base desire, right?
So can base desire be irrational?
No, that's like it's unfixable because it's inherent to like your nature as an organism. Like you could say like I hate this fact, but there's nothing you can do about it. It's just how you are. You can't change like the inherent operation of like your brain. It's just doesn't seem like something you could do.
Well, so I did think that we can change if our base desire is just what we ultimately aim at. I think that we can change that. So I mean, if we consider a person who goes from caring a lot, from like caring about, being an anti-realist deontologist, we can convince they can.
That's not a base desire.
Have their base desire just be to maximize.
Like we could say that's their base if it's not.
Why is that not? I mean, one thing is I'm sort of skeptical that there's one underlying thing that explains all of the things that we aim at. I think that most people tend to have a mishmash of desires. That one.
Like they do have a mismatch of desires. I mean, even I could see that maybe it's not one, right? But there's certain elements of our nature that we just can't like rationalize our way out of. We can't rationalize ourselves into constantly assuming like these like an altruistic perspective in all decisions all the time. We can't rationalize ourselves into, for some reason, I don't know, like having a seizure every time we see a banana. Like these are not things that we can control. There's certain like base elements of us that are just kind of beyond what we can touch, and there's elements of us that we can touch, right? So we could say base desires if that leaves you more satisfied. But I mean, in either case, like these base desires, I think under like any really basic theory about like human motivation, would say that we're clearly going to care, no matter what you say, more about us as individual persons than like other like any sort of abstract subject that we're completely unrelated to. And so like there's like this inherent level of care and desire and motivation that's just beyond touching. Would you agree with that?
Well, sorry, you cut out for part of it, but I think I got most of it, except I missed the question.
Oh, I was just saying, do you think that there's any sort of desires or elements like of our being that are beyond the scope of what we can rationally like argue away or impact?
Oh yeah, of course. But I think that in the case, so what we aim at, I think that it's not always subject to reason, but I think that reason can change what we aim at. So if anytime a person is convinced that something new is worth aiming at. So if a natural law theorist becomes convinced of utilitarianism, then suddenly they start to aim at maximizing everyone's well-being rather than following the bizarre set of things that natural law theorists aim at. Then I think that can be their ultimate aim, and that can change because of
I don't think that's their ultimate aim, because they could change it, right? Like the ultimate aim, the base desire is like almost by definition. You can say there's like absolutely no base desire, and like the human mind and decision making is like completely malleable, which I think would make absolutely no sense, because then you would like kind of lead to humans with behavior that is like so incredibly diverse that I mean trying to explore that mentally would be quite a trip. But like that's clearly not the reality we live in. But the base desire are the things that you can't really impact. And And so I guess in this case, this person can change their mind. So rationality needs to appeal to something, right? So like if I'm a natural law theorist, right, and I have some wonky beliefs, you're making an argument to me. You're trying to appeal to something, so I change my mind. What are you appealing to? If it's not anything that I desire.
Well, I don't know that I think that it has to, like, it can change what you desire. So
You have to appeal to something I
you're
do,
convinced.
right?
Well, no, I mean, it can be the case that once your beliefs change, that in turn changes your desires.
That can be true for sure. But in order to make an argument for me to change one of my desires, don't you have to appeal to something I desire, right? Like think about this argument that the utilitarian makes to the natural law theorist, right? They'll say like this thing that you're doing, like this doesn't make any sense, right? Like this is irrational. Here's the reasons why. Look how we can apply your logic. It's problematic. Blah 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 blah. They have to appeal to something else. They can't just be like bam reasons, some sort of abstract logic that you don't care about. It doesn't appeal to like logic has to be connected to something, to some sort of desire, to some sort of wants.
But I think that I don't think that's necessarily true. Like I think that one can be convinced that various things are worth aiming at, even if they previously had no. Like I mean, if we just imagine a being who currently doesn't think anything's worth aiming at, a nihilist who now has no desires and is just indifferent to everything, then you convince them that some things are worth aiming at. You're not appealing to any desires.
No, you are. The nihilist can say like, oh, life is pointless and whatever, but they still do care about pleasure. I mean, they still eat, they still continue to operate, and they're still like interested in having
this nihilist who just, let's imagine a nihilist who just sits in a room. Just imagine a nihilist who just stays stationary, doesn't care about pleasure. They're really just indifferent to all states of affairs.
They wouldn't be because
something matter.
Because they wouldn't be though, because in order for us to believe that, we'd have to believe that if we took this subject and we inserted them into the like land of like actual hell or actual heaven, that within them there would be absolutely no preference for either state, even if they were being, given that they're being perfectly rational. And I think that's very implausible. I think you'd have to suspend basically all of our knowledge about humans, how humans operate, in order to do so.
Well, I think it's a descriptive. I think it's a descriptive fact that there wouldn't be a human like that, but we can imagine a possible being that's like that.
Well, we can imagine another species that operates differently and derive different conclusions than we would derive from humans, right? I mean, the question that's like pertinent right now that we're trying to just figure out is whether there's things that we can't control about, like what humans desire, or whether humans are like blank slates. And I just don't think it's like plausible that they're blank slates.
Well, even if we say that in order for a human, I mean, we've disputed this point for a while, but even if we grant that you're right, that humans have to have some desire in order for, a person has to have a desire to be moral in order to be convinced that by moral arguments. Well, as long as a person has a desire for being rational, then I think we can convince them that they should be moral. By pointing to the arbitrariness, you show that it's irrational to care.
But you're appealing to things they already value, and then you're just assuming, like, okay, if you're taking raw rationality, right? And they're a completely blank slate in that case, then there's nothing you can appeal to. What you're doing in this argument is you're saying this is something you desire, right? You think you care about your well-being, and look at this example. Look, this is inconsistent, right? It's inconsistent that you don't care about yourself on Tuesdays. Like, obviously that doesn't make any sense, partially because it's not intuitive, because that would never happen. And then you're like, well, let's be impartial about this. Why don't we just say all future states, all subjects matter equally, right? Let's just apply this evenly. You're taking something they already desire and just rationally extrapolating from there, and then, okay, saying impartiality and stuff matters, but you're operating off of a base desire. And then I guess implicit in that is just assuming the base desire is valid. right?
So even if as long as people have a base desire to not be foolish, then we can show that that rationality requires a person through philosophical argument to be a utilitarian. So we can show that so the Parfit style arguments show that rationality requires us to be impartial. And then we can show, I think that we can employ various philosophical arguments to show that there are some things that are worth caring about, such that, if we were rational and impartial, we would care about various things. If we imagine being behind a veil of ignorance, or if we imagine experiencing everyone's life, and so on, that those would.
But again, each of these cases, you're appealing to something. But like, can you address like my point in this case? Aren't you very clearly appealing to a desire we already have?
Well, I've just granted for a moment that that our reasons can't generate abstract pondering can't generate any desires by itself. I don't agree with that, but I've granted it for a moment. And then I'm saying it's true that psychological fact is perfectly compatible with moral realism.
Okay, I mean, I think it's
perfectly compatible with that.
I mean, I think you said the desire to be foolish. We can take the desire to not be foolish and then get there. I mean, that doesn't really sound like you're conceding the fact, right? If my only desire is not to be foolish, how do you get me to care about well-being or anything like that? I mean, you have to appeal to the argument you made previously mutually contradicts like this idea. It's not like necessarily compatible. So maybe it's a new one.
If your desire is to be rational, then if you know that if you're convinced by the future Tuesday indifference argument and various other arguments that show that there are irrational desires, then that shows that you're rational. So just the assumption that if one wants to be rational, those show that you should pursue your own well-being, and then the considerations about why partiality is arbitrary, the self is fake, and so on.
Why should we?
Well, because of the various arguments, like appeal to various thought experiments like future Tuesday indifference.
But the future Tuesday one just assumes you already care about your well-being, and that this is something you already want, and so you're just being inconsistent with it. And look at this other inconsistency. Being consistent is valuable, thus you should agree with my point. It's totally appealing to two desires. It's the fact that it's assuming that you already desire your own well-being, which is my entire point. But then it's saying, okay, look, inconsistency is bad, too. So let's be consistent.
Okay, we can consider another case because I think that it's an argument for the claim that you're rationally required to consider your own well-being. It's not just assuming that. So imagine a case where a person just wants to be as miserable as possible. Well, in that case, this person just doesn't take the fact that some action would cause agony to count against taking that action. Well, in that case, it seems pretty clear that the person is acting irrationally. And so...
Why? If that's actually how they operate...
Well, I mean...
Then why?
I mean, I think most people would have the intuition that a person who wants to be miserable is acting contrary to reason. Maybe you couldn't convince a person of this, but you can't convince flat earthers of anything. That doesn't mean that...
Well, Matthew, I love this. I love this example because, yeah, you can say well, let's just take a person who doesn't operate like normal humans. Look, they're going to do things that normal humans would be like, wow, that's kind of weird. I wouldn't do that, right? We want well-being, like I said. So whenever people don't pursue their own well-being and operate completely oppositely, we're going to say that doesn't make any sense, right? It doesn't make any sense because those behaviors don't bring about the things that generally individuals want. That's the reason why. Right?
Well,
their mind.
I don't think that's true. I mean, so there are lots of things. I mean, let's imagine that there was a being that... I mean, we can imagine a being that wants to do things that bring in pleasure, that knows to do. But we don't think that being is acting irrationally. I don't think that just because some being has weird desires, that makes it so that it seems to us like the desires are necessarily irrational.
If I desire to suffer like that, I just operate the opposite of everybody else, right? I want to maximize my own suffering in my life, but somehow I don't die. Like somehow I've just managed to be like immortal. Okay, rationally convince me that I should actually care about my well-being. Let
Well, I
me do
don't think
that.
that I could rationally. Well, I don't think I could rationally convince you, but I also don't think I could rationally convince a flat earther that they're wrong, because I think that I mean, very often things will come. I mean, flat earthers just are very stubborn, But in this case, the reason I couldn't convince you is because the thing that I would appeal to is the very obvious intuition that abject misery is bad, and that's very intuitive, and pretty much everyone accepts that.
But it's
But if
bad
you don't,
because everybody like inherently perceives it as bad, right? That's the reason why. Like this is like it's inherent to like how we conceive reality. It's inherent to like the definition of bad. In my case, you can't do that. And in the case of the flat earther, you can't convince them because they have an inaccurate perception of reality and they're stubborn, right? Like they don't understand that
well,
this is
they,
true. Wait, the burden of
well,
proof
I
here
think
is like
this
the burden.
person
Wait,
has an inaccurate
oh, you can't hear me? Can you hear
perception
me?
of reality. They're-
Matthew, can you
Yeah,
hear
I
me?
can hear you.
Okay, like the burden of proof in
Yes.
both of these situations is very different. The burden of proof in the flat earther situation is which theory is more simple and aligns with our observations of reality better. That's really easy, right? It's really easy to say. They don't have to agree with you, but it's clear who's right. When you tell somebody this is not something you should want, right? Usually I would think you'd have to appeal to their base desire. You have to show them that this really isn't something you want. You actually want something else. And this thing that you actually want, it's better produced by this certain activity, right? You want to experience pleasure. This activity is not bringing you about pleasure, blah, 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 right? But in the case, the example I've given you, I'm a person who does not care about well-being. Like legitimately, no matter what, I will always want more like suffering. And I don't see any way in which you can use like logic to tell me that actually I should want something different than that.
Well, I think that this person is sort of like a nihilist. So, with a nihilist, if a person says, I have no beliefs, or a skeptic, I have no beliefs about anything. And then you say, oh, but what about this obvious belief? And they say, yeah, I just reject that. Because they'll say, that's founded on axioms. I see no reason to accept the axioms, even though, there are no shared premises that you and them share from which you can reason to them being wrong about. They're still wrong in that there is a premise that they ought to accept because the premise is true, and it is obvious that they don't accept, even if you couldn't convince them. I think that's just due to error on their part.
But in this case is different than the nihilist. And you're right in the case of the nihilist. And I would agree with you because the nihilist does care about their well-being, whether they mention it or not. They do care about it. It's just inherent to them. That's what I would say. It's inherent to them existing as a
I
biological
can
organism.
imagine beings.
Wait, can I finish really quickly? They care about it.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
And so I'll make an argument based on things that I know they value, because in reality, nihilists are actually, it's a specific philosophy because they value certain things. They say this is arbitrary. You're assuming things. They think arbitrariness is bad, right? Like there's tons of things they actually care about, right? Um, but in the case that they didn't even care about anything, I would say, well, you care about your well-being, whether you believe it or not, and these are things that would help you pursue that in your rational pursuit of your well-being. And they could disagree with me, but we could say they're being irrational because they're not pursuing the thing that they actually want. In the case of the person who wants something that's completely different than everybody else, and they genuinely want suffering, there's no way you could tell them they're being irrational and not wanting well-being. You could say it's weird. All of us think so, right? Because that's how we operate. But you can't tell them, say like, oh, describe them as irrational for the fact that they are that way.
Okay, but so in the case of I wasn't referring to the case of the nihilist. I misspoke. I meant, and I clarified that I was talking about the skeptic, right? So the person who just who says, I don't have any beliefs. Maybe they have desires. Maybe they don't. When they're in pain, they don't like it, but they have no beliefs about anything because they think all the beliefs are founded on axioms. They don't see a reason to accept the axioms. Um, even though this person is not ultimately convinced of, there's nothing that you can say to convince them. And this person is, there's no factual, like, it's not like you can say, but you believe this and this contradicts it. No, they don't believe any of that. And so in that case, I think that it's analogous to the case with the person who doesn't think suffering is bad, in that, while it's true that there's nothing that you can say to convince them, you're just going to say, here's this very plausible principle. And they'll say, I disagree with it. And you say, okay, well, I think that this principle is really obvious. Even though you can't convince them, that's also true in the case of the skeptic about, various things like the external world.
So I think I understand the difference now. So you just say, well, this axiom is just so plausible that it's like inherently true. And so like disagreeing with, like, we could start from that axiom just because it's just true, right? That people should want to pursue their well-being. I would say that it's not like inherently true. It's just like, it's just a descriptive fact of reality that people pursue their well-being. And if there ever was a person who didn't want to pursue their well-being truly, they weren't confused, they weren't convinced otherwise, like, it's just inherent to them as an organism. Well, we couldn't say they were irrational in doing so. They're just different, like descriptively speaking, in how they operate. And so I guess, like, I don't see how we can jump to just saying, well, this thing is something that a lot of us perceive as true. This is a thing that's generally true, to saying this is the objectively true thing that everybody should try to pursue. And if you're not pursuing it, you're being irrational.
I mean, you're just disagreeing with the intuition that suffering is bad, or that suffering is bad independently of our desires. But I mean, I think that a person who just, decides that they just want to be as miserable as possible, I mean, it very much seems like they're being irrational. It seems like the person with future Tuesday indifference is being irrational. It seems like a person who's a consistent anorexic who starves themselves to death because they have a deeper desire to be thin, even if it results in vast amounts of suffering. It seems like all these cases are being irrational, and this is easily explained by the hypothesis that, what we have reason, that we have various prudential reasons to increase our well-being.
I think we're at an impasse, Matthew, but this was a very interesting discussion.
Yeah, we could wrap up now. This was a lot of fun.
I don't think we really conceded anything either way, but it was enlightening, at least. For sure.
Yeah. All right, cool. Thanks for watching, everyone. Good chat. See you later.